Hi, David Allison, University of Alabama, Birmingham. Thanks for a nice session. I wanted to offer a couple of comments and questions, particularly to Amy. Amy, are you still there?
Just unmuted myself, yep.
Great. First of all, thanks for a very nice talk. I think you did a terrific job. I wanted to offer a couple of clarifications because I know that one of the papers for which I was the lead author was one of the ones you mentioned early in your talk as laying out some of these ideas. And I think it's important to distinguish that not all of the papers, which are by different authors, say the same things. And so I'm going to speak only for the paper that I'm an author of. And the paper and papers that I've been an author of, we've been very clear that our conclusions about dietary intake methods have been limited to conclusions about dietary intake by self-report as a measure of energy intake. We have offered no conclusion one way or another about other aspects. And so the idea that based on statements about dietary energy intake, we have therefore concluded that all dietary self-report data are useless is not an accurate statement of what we have said. I do not deny that others have said that.
Okay.
The second thing...
Sorry, are you finished?
Sure, no problem. The second thing is just on rhetoric. And again, I think, judge the papers individually. We've tried to be very civil and courteous and professional in our dialogue, and as you have. And again, I think it's important to distinguish among papers in that. Third, the idea that the conclusions about energy intake, which actually you and I agree with, are based upon the findings of one paper, in our case, are not true. We're referencing papers that have gone back quite some time. We've been involved in this thing for years, and so this is not a single paper by a single author that points out the energy issues. As you've said, this knowledge goes back a long time. And then the last thing I'll say, there are a couple of other points, but I won't get into the details, I think is a challenge for the field, and I will say that all of us, including me, including you, one thing we've not done well as scientists is we have not laid out a set of criteria a priori as to when a measurement would be useful, and thereby been able to look at empirical evidence and say, does the empirical evidence suggest that those criteria are met? So what's been happening in this dialogue is all of us, again, I'm guilty as charged, myself too, we've jumped to the level of evidence, we've pointed at certain bits of evidence, and we've said, you see here's some evidence and it leads to a conclusion, without a priori saying, this is the kind of evidence a priori that would be needed to test, in fact, whether a method would be useful as a measurement device or not. And so I think it's a challenge for our field to come out and articulate that. I've actually tried a little bit, and it's not an easy thing to do, and maybe we can get together and work on that, and I think that would be a useful thing for the field. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Okay, my turn? Okay, first, David, thanks for your questions. And with respect to the first question having to do with whether the paper that you're an author on talks about all of diet as being bad because of energy, or if it really just talks about energy. I have looked at that recently, and it is cited because there's a paragraph, and maybe it wasn't intended that it meant other foods, that gets into the idea of dietary patterns and sort of overall value of looking at outcomes. And it's because of that paragraph, and it's too hard to do at a meeting like this. If we sat down and looked at it, we could look at it. But there was one paragraph that is the reason that I've cited that paper, and if it wasn't meant to go farther than energy as it seemed it did to the authors of the paper, then perhaps we read it incorrectly. But it implies sort of overall diet when you got into things like dietary patterns. So that's my answer to that. But clearly the paper you're talking about is very focused on energy, and I definitely don't deny that. But there is a paragraph in there that caused me to cite it in that way. Let's see now, I've lost track. You asked like several questions. I think it's useful for us to continue this dialogue in a courteous way. And although there are many, many papers that cite the problem with underreporting, I couldn't agree with you more on that. The Archer paper provides percentages and got more press and attention based on cut points that I believe were used erroneously, and makes it look worse than it actually is. And again, not denying that there is an underreporting problem. And certainly level of evidence that we need is an important level of discourse for us to talk about in the future and to articulate. I agree with you on that. Did I cover all your questions? Sorry if I missed one. Took me a while to find a pen.
Okay, thank you, Amy. More questions?
Thank you. This is a wonderful panel. I'm Johanna Dwyer from Tufts. I was wondering on the Center for Food Integrity work, which I've followed for many years and think is wonderful. What you do with a case, and I don't mean to denigrate a particular company, but the paper has been full of Chipotle, where people have been going to Chipotle to eat in antibiotic-free, natural, blah, blah, blah. And now they all have emesis, I guess you would call it. What do you do? And you can make trust, and then what do you?
Absolutely. Is this on? I think Chipotle is such an interesting case study, and I'll be very interested to see how this pans out, knowing what we know about where they are with stocks and shareholders and the demands that have been made. If we go back, remember how practices, policies, verification, et cetera, the history of a company really matters as it relates to how people feel they've been transparent with them and whether they can trust them over time. Chipotle has had a halo for many, many years as being somebody that people can trust. Consumers feel they've been impeccably transparent about production methods, sourcing of food, ingredients they use, et cetera. If you look at media coverage, if you look at industry response, you wouldn't get necessarily that same warm fuzzy that the consumer audience feels. But I think it will be interesting because they've had that good reputation coming in. They are a beloved brand, no matter how you feel about them. If you look at how consumers have generally felt about them, they are very well liked.
Can you explain what this is to me?
Chipotle, I'm sorry. So,
I know what Chipotle paste is, but sorry.
okay. So not Chipotle paste. Okay. Chipotle is a restaurant, and they've had they have very specific sourcing guidelines, antibiotic-free meats. They made an announcement about taking GMOs out of their supply chain, a controversial announcement because of ingredients going into things like soda. In any case, over the last few months, they've had a series of outbreaks of foodborne illness, and they've had a very hard time getting that under control. So from a supply chain standpoint, something is not going correctly. It sounds like Steve Ells, their leader, has said that they have everything under control. They've taken all these extra steps to standardize processes and ensure that they're back on track. But the morale of people's tenor for that conversations about this brand are very far down, and the reactions, both in response to the way that the brand initially responded, and then now the efforts that have been made has been less than stellar. So I think it's just a practice of looking at those different things that people analyze about what's going on within companies and understanding how that's maybe setting them up for success or failure long term. I'll be right here watching as well, interested to see how this pans out. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Craig LaFay from RTI International. Thank you all for your presentations. I'm really interested, obviously from this morning, interested in how we communicate all this to the public. And my colleagues and I have been looking at some of these same issues around trust and the communication of scientific information for a couple of years now. And I kind of want to reflect first, Amy is sitting in the snow talking about uncertainty about how we assess and measure energy intake and other types of things. And we all sit here in the room and we have this very rational response to it, and We're trying to weigh the evidence and cite the facts. But in the public sphere, when we start communicating, clients I work with get very concerned about how do we communicate uncertainty, which isn't something that you were directly addressing with your slides, and maybe you'll have a few things you can add to this. But what we're finding is that when scientific information is mixed, you mentioned GMOs, the use of antibiotics in the food supply. When there's two sides to an argument, the media loves the controversy, and the media is not going to make it a 50-50 weighing of the facts, the pros and the cons of things. The media is going to make it a controversy. And what we find is that for a lot of consumers, that begins to undermine the trust in being transparent. And transparent in many cases means we don't know. We're not sure. The data is ambiguous. More research needs to be done. That makes sense to us in this room. It doesn't make a lot of sense to people who are looking for answers out there in the real world. So I'm wondering if among the panelists, and Roxi, I'm sure you have some thoughts about this too, could talk a little bit more about where are the lessons, where can we go with thinking about how to communicate uncertainty about food safety. Chipotle is a great example. What that introduces to consumer is the uncertainty. Am I going to walk into a Chipotle that is going to have an outbreak, or am I going to walk into one that's safe? And the latest evidence that I've seen, and they're projecting that by 2017, they think they'll have that under control. So it's a long period of uncertainty yet to face the consumers of that specific brand, let alone all the other issues that we're talking about when it comes to food science.
Yeah, absolutely. I can lead off here. Another thing that I've seen that's really interesting related to your point is that the media has portrayed the story in the way that they have, and it's been interesting to see even some of the conspiracy theories about how that contamination happened in that beloved brand's, midst as a plausible or a realistic example or situation that could have related to all the issues they're having now. I don't think had that been large fast food chain brand X inserted here, if that had been another brand that didn't have that equity, had the story gone the same way. And I think as we think about journalists' job, in journalism school they teach dog bites man is not a story, man bites dog is. So to your point about balance and something that's going to gain attention, it's probably not going to be, guess what, all food safe. As it relates to the accurate presentation of risks and the uncertainty with science, coming to one lone conclusion, in our 2014 research, we really did try to focus on what are the biggest themes of discussion as it relates to being able to unpack really comprehensive, complex science as well as controversial issues. So we took two case studies. One was focused on antibiotic resistance in food, and food animals obviously related, as well as genetically modified foods. We asked who are the people that you trust, and importantly, what is it that you want to hear from them? What are the types of elements you want us to address? And one of the big ones, we tested 12, and there were 5 that kind of came to the top. One of them was, I want an accurate presentation of risks. Consumers tell us time and time again, I'm smart enough, I'm good enough, give me the information and I'll decide for myself. So with us saying, don't worry about it, that raises the hairs on the back of their neck, and they absolutely can't believe what follows that statement. They want to know that we've looked at it, and that while there may be some risks, it needs to be put in proportion to what would be considered harmful. For example, pesticide use, that was brought up earlier. It's true that conventional farming is going to potentially have more pesticide residue on produce, for example, and likely that organic, the residues on organics is going to be much lower. But if you put that into perspective of there's this much residue on organics, there's this much on conventional, and the amount that we have to get worried is as tall as this room, that starts to set up the representation of risk a little bit differently. We have to find ways to storytell to showcase that risk. And I think it's another thing that we've seen with the Chipotle example and many others within this idea of, food can be scary sometimes, and yet we all have to make choices about it. There's 3 steps when you have a crisis. The first is remorse. Here's what happened, and we're very sorry about it. And it better be genuine, because the public can see through that. The next one is resolve. Here's what we've done to stop that situation and make good for what we can control today. And then restitution, the long term. What are we doing to ensure that by 2017 or whatever, we've got this and it's not going to happen again? And I think that's another thing. Just admitting what you know and what we don't is incredibly important to understanding whether we're going to get people's trust or not.
Go ahead, next question. Thank you, Roxy.
Todd Abraham from Mondelez International. I had a question about your trust measures, and not all of them are measures where consumers might have personal responsibility, but there are some where consumers can take some of their own responsibility. Did you measure it all where consumers felt they ought to take their own responsibility as opposed to always putting this on the food companies or the agricultural sector or someone else?
Well, our focus for this year's study was on transparency. So who do you hold accountable for transparency related to those different topics? So for this year, no, we didn't ask that. And what we know is...
So they never hold themselves accountable?
I was just going to say, what we know is I'm never to blame. I'm always right, as consumers. The other thing is I feel a lot of people are so far removed from food production that it's all about what somebody else has done to my food, and I'm a recipient of that, whether I would have chosen that to have happened or not. So in this case, it was focused on could we use transparency tactics, to get to a point, to showcase here's what's being done related to these different topics to be able to build trust with them long term. So no, we did not ask, are you at fault? Because we already know the answer.
Can I ask you, because I noticed that list as well, food companies and blood, and government wasn't one of those. And for me, in the UK, we would always blame the government. Right. So I'm just wondering, why didn't you include government then?
I guess another one as well, I think there are some issues with transparency and whether people feel government is transparent or not. And with ours and our constituents, we were really interested in digging into those 4 different topics, also knowing you've got limited time that you can spend with survey respondents online. Yes. And it would be interesting to look at long term.
And sorry, maybe it isn't worth going in depth, but also on the food safety side of things, I was really surprised at what a small percentage was restaurants. So then that made me slightly doubt what you'd found or maybe how you'd put the question, because the food companies came out worse for it all. And I mean, you've been talking about your Chipotle thing, and you people must be aware, maybe it's later, but whatever. I just wonder why restaurants hadn't come out worse.
The thing that we saw about restaurants, and qualitatively we have information on this as well, restaurants kind of get a free pass. People don't go to restaurants to make healthful decisions. They don't go there to understand all of the sourcing. They go there to indulge in most cases. So very consistently we see that. And also in our 2014 research, the idea of a government scientist versus, so different types of individuals we asked about and we were testing our model. So there's values, who you are and the decisions you make. The competence that you bring as a scientist or having facts to back what you say, and then the influential other that you are, whether you're a friend or a family or somebody that I already trust because you're my doctor or dietitian or mechanic. When you take those different elements, the government scientist in our model represented fully competence. A mother who's a scientist represented the mix of values and competence. And then a peer who shares my interest. Yes, if you're a mom scientist or a female scientist in general, we should chat about the opportunities that you have. And that doesn't mean anybody needs to have gender reassignment surgery in this room. But there's a lot that you can do through communications to showcase, and that's the reason I asked, is anybody in here a parent? Because if you can talk about being a parent, no matter what gender you are, that matters to people. It assigns a value innately, simply because you share something with them. So when we looked at government scientists, just that in and of itself, they've had much lower trust ratings, just bar none, simply because they didn't exude that values-based connection. Now, the great news about that is when they started saying, gosh, as a parent, the government scientist, as a parent and as somebody who's so incredibly focused on environment, I'm a cyclist and I do all these different things as it relates to production of whatever they were studying. Water runoff is so important because I love to enjoy the weekend, outdoor hours. When you can make those connections that are genuine to you and then tie to your values and talk about the science, then you have the opportunity for success.
Okay. So thank you very much, Roxy. No, it's okay. We've talked a lot about trust, and so I was just hoping to interject one question in terms of the new dietary assessment methods that we talked about, and the utility really with respect to food safety research and monitoring. And Janet, you touched on this a bit, and Antonia, you did as well. But can we expand on that a little bit more about the utility of these new methods for, say, contaminants, more sort of on the food safety side?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, it's probably, well, for the things that I was talking about, it's early days. So your Chipotle thing might well be of interest, you know, to go down the tweet route, because actually, probably they're not the only ones suffering, or maybe they are, but actually measuring these things is quite difficult, and that's where you actually measure the truth of it, or otherwise, or try to, but clearly expensive, sampling required, all these things which really put challenges towards making sort of new technologies. What you'd want is some kind of sensor that people could just have on them, and then it gives back all the information that you need.
Yeah. As I mentioned, one of the biomonitoring that we practice is kind of targeted biomonitoring, so you know what you're looking for. So if you're interested in looking at the risk of a particular contaminant, then you need to know what contaminant is the one. And that wouldn't take into consideration unexpected ones or something that is emerging and we're not looking for. Certainly sampling is very important because not all results are equal. So, you know, junk in, junk out. Even if you had the best instruments, the best chemists, and the best facilities. So your samples have to be properly collected, they have to be properly stored too, and then you have to avoid contamination. Remember I said certain, you know, we measure in very low levels, trace levels compared to what is in the environment. If the biomarker that you happen to look for is ubiquitous in the environment, then you better make sure that you're not introducing it during sampling or storage. So I would say that there's still quite a bit of work to do, but certainly the technology is there. I don't think we are at the point that we can use those sensors, that they would say, here we are, at least for certain chemicals, maybe for some of the biomarkers, the nutritional biomarkers.
Yeah, and probably what we do have access to might mean that actually there's an underestimate of the risk to the population at large, although you would try to weight your results because the at-risk groups, low socioeconomic group, different groups within the population who won't take part or are not able to be involved in research are always underestimated there, so and maybe more at risk of contamination.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Christy, did you have a question?
I think it's quick. It's for Amy again. So it's clear that using self-reported data for energy intake is maybe not the way to go. I'm wondering, though, about its application for clinical trials comparing two matched groups. Is that still a use of self-reported energy intake data?
So two matched groups, assuming it's possible it might be okay. You're talking about a study in which you're looking at energy balance kinds of things, or
one of the,
are you looking
yeah,
at
say you're comparing a variety of different dietary measures, one of those being energy.
It's risky. It's just risky. It's better if you have a matched group. It's not as bad as other things, but I still think we have to be really careful about thinking we can use energy if you sort of are, intervening on one group versus another. You have all sorts of other things going on as well that can affect the biases in reporting.
Can I add to that as well? Well, I think that it might be possible. You may be able to do some sort of triangulation. It depends if your trial is, if it's around weight loss, then you might really struggle because of, changes in reporting. But if it was for something else, you might manage that. Depends on the method. Amy says don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which I entirely agree with. So depends on the population, depends what you're trying to do, and depends on the method that you're using to record intake, self-report, and so on. Some people can do it, but not everybody, and maybe where you've got matched data or, randomly allocated, yes, big measurement error for everybody, but shouldn't bias your results, I wouldn't have. But I think, obviously, if it's a weight loss trial, that might be different.
Yeah, I was
Right,
thinking
I
of
agree.
yeah, this was a trial where we did decide to bring people into the lab and, have them eat from a buffet and measure their intake that way for several days. But I was just looking at that design thinking, are we introducing more bias by, having them eat at this study center, eating
Yeah.
a buffet, than if they were just
Free
eating
living.
ad libitum and reporting it?
Yeah, sorry, and the thing I meant to mention, I started with triangulation. I mean, if it's not about weight loss, then you could at least sort of, if it's over a period of time, you could, even if you can't have doubly labeled water or whatever, maybe weight change, maybe some other measure that might give you a whole, handle on what should have been happening in that person, might help as sort of,
Thank
approach.
you. Sorry, I said to be quick.
If I could add,
Thank
if I
you.
could add a little bit here, if you're talking about sort of a more of a contrived feeding situation, it's really a very different thing. I was thinking of a free living one when you discussed that, and I agree with Jana. I just think, we need to view those findings cautiously, whatever, when it comes to the energy. You could look at lots of other aspects of eating them to change, but the absolute energy is where there could be some issues. Yeah.
So, Kathy Weimer from General Mills, Bell Institute. I have actually 3 questions.
No, you only get one.
Oh, only get one. Okay, sorry. Well, one specific, Amy, I'm curious, related to NHANES, I was under the impression that now with the Multipath methodology, that methodology has reduced the underestimation of energy as well as portion size. If I remember correctly, that was one of the intents. So maybe if you wouldn't mind clarifying if that has happened, that might be helpful. And then my next question is really for Janet, related to, given the wide variation in the caloric representation that we saw in your chart from these different mobile apps and programs, is there any collaboration or any efforts being done to address this? Because in my mind, that's kind of a disservice to consumers who are trying to use this and monitor what their intakes are, and I would think the primary use of that would be energy intake. So I'm just curious if there's any efforts around that. And then my third question is, just given the title of the session, what gets measured gets changed, if each of you might take a shot at what is a next step that could be reasonable in terms, especially around the energy intake, and what could be done?
Amy, do you want to start with the first question?
Sure. So in terms of the multipath method that USDA has used in NHANES for a number of years, prior to that, they didn't, the methods in NHANES have changed subtly over time, but the multipath method has been used in the last few cycles. And certainly from not using multipath to multipath, there was a reduction in measures of underreporting. Nevertheless, while there were reductions, there still remains some level of underreporting in NHANES.
Okay. Janet, the second question?
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. Yes, the app tracking and variations in energy intake. I think our paper was probably the first one to review these, and that was just published in December last year. So it's quite a new, as it were, revelation. And I know from trying to work with one or two of those companies that at the time, a few years ago, very secretive about their data. So, as it were, what I've described as the back-end database wasn't going to be available to other groups. Now, with the generation of open data, Entente Cordiale, etc., maybe that's changing. So, it's a good suggestion to try and sort of bring it together, really, yeah. What was the other one?
And I just want to add that a very motivated individual filling out any of these things, if there is an adequate database and all that, can get a fairly accurate energy value for themselves. But when you get into research and you have all the biases, you can run into trouble. But an individual filling out one of these things can do it pretty well if they're really highly motivated.
And then the third question was, because the session title is What Gets Measured Gets Changed, is how each of the panelists thinks the next steps for improving the situation are. So if anybody wants to be the first, feel free.
I'll jump
in. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't know if I have the perfect solution, but as I saw that title a couple months ago for the first time, and within our own company, we really focus on what we manage, what we measure, not necessarily we change what we measure. And I think it's just interesting in this dynamic that we would think that just something, because something gets measured, if we say it has to change, that implies that what we're doing today is wrong. And so I think it's interesting as it relates to the consumer dynamic and the way that we communicate. What we're trying to do at the center is really to address the gap that exists between perception of what goes on and the reality of what's being done within the industry. And so looking at those markers over time and measuring perception versus reality and what the expectation misalignment is, that can help us do better. I think ultimately it doesn't mean we have to change the practice, but from our perspective, we absolutely have to change the way we think about communication if we're going to be successful as an industry collectively.
I think it's repeating a little bit what Roxi said, but that you measure something, you bring attention to a particular topic, and people are aware that certain practices may result in exposures that they may or may not be aware of. Doesn't mean that these exposures are a problem, doesn't mean that they're gonna hurt them, but in some cases they could. And then just bringing attention to a particular topic that somebody didn't think about, then it may just be of interest. And then may lead to certain interventions that could result in reduced exposures if that's necessary.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it is clear from, epidemiological work that we can, and as Amy said, consistent findings. We can already, with our relatively weak measures, show impacts of food on health. I think, though, we can do even better, and maybe where there's been that sort of, this study's shown something, another study hasn't. You've got, the devil is always in the detail. Look at what methods they were using. Maybe the sample size was too small, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we can try to raise standards, do better, measure more nuanced aspects of diet in this whole approach.
And there's...
Can I jump in here?
Sure.
I would say that, and I agree with what Janet just said with reference to epi, and with respect to surveillance, what gets measured gets changed. Well, the data from NHANES are used to establish nutrition policy, and things like showing too much sugar intake or too little fruit intake, or whether people are meeting the healthy, criteria set by the Healthy Eating Index and their score, is actually, that is getting measured, and it is causing policy change and formulation of our policy in the U.S. So I would say that the title, What Gets Measured Gets Changed, is already, in progress when it comes to what we use our surveillance data for.